Yes, Jordan, stay with us. Let's look at those talks that are ongoing. Hamas say that these discussions remain tough, blaming Israeli intransigence for the stalemate. Key issues still on the table include the flow of aid into Gaza, complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Strip, and strong guarantees for a permanent ceasefire. Despite the challenges, Hamas has agreed to release 10 hostages as part of the ongoing negotiations. The move comes amid renewed international pressure to end the war. Talks are intensifying in Doha, but officials say significant gaps remain. Efforts continue to reach a breakthrough and stop the bloodshed after nearly 2 years of relentless fighting. Well, Jordan, thank you for staying with us. Of course, stuff to unpack here. Firstly, let's look at the fact that Hamas say that they're willing to do a partial hostage release. This, of course, coming after months since the last hostage release and since fighting resumed. How significant is this, not just for the Israeli government, but the Israeli people, of course, who have suffered with up to 250 hostages taken after those October 7th attacks?
Well, of course, every Israeli life saved will be considered a victory by part of the Israeli public. However, much of the Israeli public will certainly consider it a continuing aggravation if not all of the hostages are released and Hamas is not ejected from power. The reason that there has been such a struggle to forge a ceasefire agreement is because Hamas knows that the longer it can keep this war going, the better it can be at its attempt to delegitimize Israel and ultimately pursue its later goal, which is to destroy Israel, which Hamas has made very clear is one of its key goals in its charter. And so what Israel ultimately hopes to do is probably something reasonable, such as ensuring that Hamas's leaders are expelled out of the Gaza Strip and that its leadership is no more in the Gaza Strip. There are many competing factions currently in the Gaza Strip for power right now, militias such as the Abu Shabaab militia, and with Israel closing in on nearly being able to be in control of 75% of the Gaza Strip, Hamas realizes that its bargaining power is becoming less and less. However, if it can still keep the hostages out of Israel's reach for as long as possible, it can in part legitimize itself in a perverse way as being the leading actor when it comes to Islamist resistance and terrorism in the Gaza Strip, confusing Israel, bamboozling Israel. And so Israel ultimately, in order to demonstrate that Hamas is on its last legs, it needs to guarantee that Hamas is out of the Gaza Strip.
Yes, and you've alluded slightly to my next question there, but Hamas saying that gaps still remain. Can you detail more of what Israel is looking for? We obviously know Hamas is looking for a permanent end to this conflict, but what are Benjamin Netanyahu's key aims as his administration goes into these discussions in direct talks in Doha?
It's important to note that the conversations recently with Netanyahu and President Trump in DC were actually behind closed doors. And so it's definitely a bit more confusing and maybe not quite as transparent, the rumors currently circulating regarding the negotiations behind the ceasefire and those that are happening right now in Doha. However, one should be aware that Qatar is a mastermind when it comes to forging deals that ultimately benefit the interests of Islamist parties, and Hamas is one of its greatest beneficiaries, having received approximately $2 billion since 2012. Hamas ultimately receives about $30 million a month from Qatar, and Qatar ultimately has an interest in ensuring that it remains in power. So while Qatar ultimately feigns an interest in the United States and a feigned friendship, what it has ultimately done over the past few decades is ultimately undermine the US at the same time. It might offer the United States a military base in Qatar, but it will certainly also regulate where and when the US can and cannot attack. And so surely, even though it is feigning a persona as an unbiased, objective mediator, Qatar also has its interest at hand in ensuring that Hamas remains in power. After all, Hamas's leadership, much of it still remains in Qatar, And if Qatar ultimately wanted to help bring this war about to an end, it could have expelled Hamas's leadership, it could have cut funding to Hamas, and it ultimately chose not to. So the big gaps, going back to your question, that probably remain, will ultimately be making sure that Hamas is ejected from the Gaza Strip, ensuring all of the hostages returning home. Hamas will probably want to make sure that it remains in power and that Israel ultimately withdraws from all of the Gaza Strip, and hence it will present that as a victory, one so perverse, but nevertheless one that Hamas will use to legitimize its sustained and continued rule.
Yes, Jordan, we're going to look at the devastation that has been caused by the hostages that are held in Gaza by Hamas shortly, but I do want to talk about the humanitarian situation ongoing in the Gaza Strip. Hospital officials saying that on Wednesday, 40 Palestinians killed in Israeli strikes. Of course, not all of these affiliated with Hamas. Is there more pressure, do you think, on a ceasefire now because global opinion on the conflict and global diplomacy around the humanitarian situation that's being reported as famine by many groups is continuing for another month and affecting millions of displaced people in the enclave?
The argument regarding famine has been rebutted time and time again throughout the war. The war is indeed tragic. Civilians have died. But even amidst one of the most recent bouts of violence in a very densely populated urban area, as military expert John Spencer has noted, it's been one of the most humane wars that has been conducted in terms of the lengths Israel's gone to provide humanitarian aid. The aid that Israel's allowed in has actually been higher than it was before the war. On top of that, providing millions of warnings, whether it be evacuation notices, whether it be warning noises on top of buildings, millions of phone calls issued to try to save as many civilians as possible. When it comes to the pressure that Israel will be feeling in this war and the pressure to stop, it will ultimately be coming from its ally in the United States and from President Trump, who has his own interest in seeing this war come to an end, in the sense that Donald Trump will ultimately want to advance the Abraham Accords. And it's very possible that there might be some countries lurking in the scenes waiting for this war to end so they can therefore justify renewed or even new ties with Israel based on security agreements, perhaps based on water or technology or pharmaceutical agreements that will benefit them in the near future. So while this war is indeed devastating, and while this war has involved civilian deaths, just as every war does, it's also important to take into account the efforts that Israel has gone to spare civilians in urban warfare. And as the UN notes, in modern day warfare, 90% of all casualties in modern day warfare are often civilians. And it looks like Israel, even when using Hamas's debunked statistics that have time and time again tried to make it seem that the civilian casualties are even higher, it seems that Israel is still outperforming modern democracies in modern day warfare in terms of sparing civilian lives.
Jordan, but very quickly before we move on, I just want to look at your claim there regarding aid and Israel letting in more aid. In recent weeks, 130 NGOs and charities called for the halting of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, US-backed, with, of course, support from Israel. And there have been reports that have been backed up about killings around these aid centres. So I just want to pose that to you and ask you where your sources are in terms of relating to this amount of aid that is going in when so many are saying there is a famine. You're providing one source, but could you back that up a little bit more?
Sure. So going back to this source that more aid has actually come in, Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who recently ousted Netanyahu, was actually responsible for helping raise awareness to other statistics, such as the 1.7 million tons of aid having come in this war, which apparently is even higher than the aid that was allowed before the war began. And if you look at those 130 NGOs, many of them often are affiliated with reports renowned for anti-Israel bias. If I recall, Amnesty International was one of those orgs that signed on which not only has systemic problems of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias within its ranks. I encourage you to read an article I wrote for the Jerusalem Post a while as an opinion piece in the Jerusalem Post a while back. But on top of that, if you look at open source information technology, you can simply see many Gaza grocery stores and restaurants completely replete with food. The problem is not so much the food going in, it's the problem is with Hamas all too often monopolizing the supplies, trying to sell them at higher rates when they should be distributed for free. And that's exactly why the Gaza Humanitarian Fund was established, to make sure that they could circumvent Hamas, its efforts to monopolize aid distribution and to kill civilians who line up for the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. Hamas is ultimately trying to dehumanize and delegitimize these programs currently ongoing in the Gaza Strip, because it's an effort to circumvent from Hamas's power and to make sure that Hamas doesn't monopolize rule over the people and their critical resources. And so people are getting aid in the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, though, at the same time, Hamas is making it very expensive for some in the Gaza Strip. So there are a few facts, hopefully, to aid the information that you wanted.
Yes, Jordan, thank you for providing that information. If you stay with us, we're going to stay